The Crusades. Between 1096 and 1291, a series of holy wars exploded across Europe and the Middle East. They were called the Crusades, Christian military campaigns officially blessed by the papacy to reclaim Jerusalem and defend the faith. What began as pilgrimage and promise of forgiveness turned into nearly 2 centuries of organized massacre. The first wave in 1099 set the tone. When Crusaders entered Jerusalem, chroniclers wrote that blood ran knee-deep through the streets. Historians estimate that more than 1 million people, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, and Europeans alike, died over 9 separate crusading movements. In later expeditions, entire cities were looted, empires toppled, and even Christian towns sacked by allies. Behind the banners of the cross stood motives far less divine: land, trade routes, papal control, and adventure. The Crusades also hardened East-West division for centuries, planting mistrust that still shadow global politics. Yet, incredibly, they also spurred contact that spread science, medicine, and classical learning back into Europe. Dark tragedy feeding accidental progress. For Christianity, this chapter remains a profound contradiction. Faith meant to spread mercy became a license for slaughter. The Crusades remind us how sincerely people can believe they're serving heaven while building hell on earth, and how dangerous holiness becomes when fused with conquest.
The Spanish Inquisition. In 1478, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain secured papal approval for what would become one of history's most infamous religious tribunals, the Inquisition. Its official aim was to protect Christian purity after centuries of coexistence among Christians, Jews, and Muslims. In reality, it became a vast machine of fear. Tens of thousands of people faced interrogation and public trial. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 were executed, though many more were imprisoned, tortured, or shamed into confession. Spain's diverse culture collapsed under suspicion. Families fled, books burned, and Jews and Muslims who had lived there for centuries were expelled. Even the devout lived with the terror of denunciation. The Inquisition extended its reach across Spanish colonies, policing thought from Mexico to Manila. Its network of spies and secret archives helped build modern bureaucracy, proof that control can hide behind faith. Centuries later, Spain officially ended it, but its shadow lingered: censorship, authoritarian rule, and the lost brilliance of an erased multicultural society. The Spanish Inquisition stands as Christianity's darkest mirror, where zeal for doctrinal purity eclipsed its own core message of forgiveness. Witch hunts and the burning of heretics. From the 15th through the 18th centuries, across Europe and early America, waves of hysteria turned superstition and theology into weapons. The church and state courts alike hunted witches, heretics, and anyone who didn't fit the accepted image of faith. Roughly 40,000 to 60,000 people, mostly women, were executed, often by hanging or burning. Entire villages lived under the spell of accusation. A failed harvest, a sick child, an eccentric neighbor could all trigger death. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum 1486 gave devilry a legal blueprint, proof that even printing presses can spread madness. Beneath the witch trials lay deeper fears: plague, famine, social change, knowledge challenging old authority. Condemnation became a way to feel control, to prove loyalty to both church and community. When the Enlightenment ideas finally labeled witchcraft superstition, the trials faded, but the moral scar stayed. The witch hunts reveal how religion's language of evil can mutate into a crowd ritual of blame. In those fires, ignorance presented itself as righteousness, and thousands paid for collective insecurity with their lives. The 30 Years' War. From 1618 to 1648, Central Europe descended into one of the bloodiest catastrophes in human history, the 30 Years' War. It began as a dispute between Catholic and Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire and spiraled into a continental conflict involving nearly every major European power. For 3 decades, armies marched under religious banners yet fought largely for political gain. The numbers stagger historians. By the war's end, population losses in parts of Germany reached 1/3. Disease, famine, and pillage devastated the countryside.
Towns changed face at sword point, soldiers looted altars while claiming devotion. Lutheran, Calvinist, and Catholic leaders each promised God's favor, turning theology into gunfire. When exhaustion finally forced peace at Westphalia in 1648, Europe gained its first modern model of national sovereignty and a deep skepticism towards holy war. Religion retreated into the private sphere, diplomacy replaced crusade, but the trauma left centuries of cultural memory. Pews half empty, fields unplanted, souls unsure if heaven could ever justify such ruin. The 30 Years' War stands as the turning point where Western faith learned, brutally, that salvation and power make a deadly mix.
Caste discrimination and untouchability in the Indian context have been used to justify social inequality and keep people in their place based on birth. Over centuries, those symbolic divisions hardened into birth-based hierarchy. Brahmins at the top, Dalits, the so-called untouchables, at the bottom. What started as spiritual order turned into social exclusion. For at least 2 millennia, purity codes regulated every part of life. Who could touch whom, share water, read scripture, or enter temples. Millions were denied education or dignity under the claim that hierarchy was divinely ordained karma. Even Buddhist and Bhakti reformers who preached equality struggled to loosen the caste grip. British colonial law later froze those identities in census categories, making a moral wound administrative. Independent India outlawed untouchability in 1950, yet caste bias persists in rural violence and subtle urban discrimination. Activists from B.R. Ambedkar to countless reformers have fought to reread scripture for justice, not division. The caste system's shadow shows how a religious metaphor of cosmic balance can, through habit and fear, trap real people beneath it, and how faith must constantly choose between sanctifying order or sanctifying compassion.
The Partition of India, 1947. 76 years ago, the British Empire ended its rule of the Indian subcontinent, but its exit carved the land along religious lines into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The Partition of 1947 was meant to be a peaceful separation. Instead, it triggered one of the largest and bloodiest migrations in recorded history. As new borders were drawn, neighbor turned on neighbor. Trainloads of refugees arrived filled not with people but with corpses. An estimated 1 to 2 million died in massacres. About 15 million were displaced. Entire communities of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs were uprooted from homes their families had lived in for centuries. Religious nationalism and colonial divide and rule policies collided, leaving wounds that still shape politics today. Even amid cruelty, there were flashes of humanity, villages protecting opposite faith families. But horror dominated memory. Partition remains a colossal warning of how quickly identity and fear can turn shared devotion into dividing fire.
The Mihna, the Islamic Inquisition. In 833 CE, the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun launched a theological crackdown known as the Mihna, or Inquisition. His empire stretched from Persia to North Africa, and he wanted doctrinal unity under his chosen view of Islam, that the Quran was created, not eternal. Those who disagreed were arrested, beaten, or forced to swear allegiance to his interpretation. The Mihna lasted about 15 years, haunting scholars and judges across the Muslim world. The most famous resistor, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, was imprisoned and flogged, but his steadfastness later made him a folk hero. When later caliphs repealed the Inquisition, the backlash shifted authority from rulers to the ulama, the independent scholars of Islamic law. The episode reveals how theology becomes political weaponry when power insists on one truth. The Mihna began as a philosophical argument and ended as a lesson about freedom of belief. Coercion can preserve doctrine, but it kills respect for it.
Sunni-Shia sectarian violence. The split between Sunni and Shia Muslims began over leadership after Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE. For centuries, it meant different traditions of scholarship and worship. But periodically, politics turned that divide into bloodshed.
From the 7th century Battle of Karbala, where Hussein ibn Ali was killed, to modern conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, rulers have used sectarian identity as justification for war. During the Safavid-Ottoman rivalries, forced conversions and massacres marked entire regions. In the 21st century, extremist movements still weaponize the distinction, bombing mosques of the other sect while claiming divine duty. Religiously, Sunnis and Shias share the Quran, the Prophet, and much of the same law. Politically, centuries of revenge have drawn a line soaked in grief. The ongoing toll defies full measurement, millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead. At its core, the Sunni-Shia tragedy shows how every faith's internal debate can degenerate once power and fear take the pulpit. What begins as interpretation ends as identity war, proving that no scripture is immune to ambition.
Buddhist nationalism and ethnic cleansing. Across much of the world, Buddhism is known for peace and nonviolence. Yet in recent decades, parts of Southeast Asia have shown its darker side, when nationalist politics fuse with religion. In Sri Lanka's civil war, and more recently in Myanmar, militant monks and political leaders invoked Buddhist identity to justify persecution of minorities. In Myanmar's Rakhine State, the Rohingya Muslim population faced systematic violence starting in 2017. Entire villages were burned, thousands killed, and more than 700,000 people were driven into refugee camps in Bangladesh. Militias wrapped their crimes in slogans about defending the Buddhist nation. The same rhetoric fueled riots against Tamils in Sri Lanka decades earlier. Long before that, colonial manipulation and ethnic favoritism had already planted suspicion between communities. Once religion became shorthand for loyalty, compassion, the core of Buddhist ethics, was silenced. These tragedies show that even a faith built on mindfulness can be turned into ideology. Whenever identity replaces empathy, nothing remains sacred, not even a religion founded on non-harm.
Confucian oppression of women. From ancient China through Korea and Japan, Confucianism was less a religion than a code of civilization. It valued harmony, hierarchy, and the proper roles of ruler, father, and son. But for women, that order came with chains. The principle of the 3 obediences instructed females to obey their father when young, their husband when married, and their sons when widowed. Virtue meant silence, modesty, and sacrifice. Over centuries, those ideas fixed gender into law. Foot binding in China, widow seclusion, and educational exclusion across East Asia. Even reforming scholars accepted the notion that a stable society required obedient women. Only in the 19th and 20th centuries did Confucian feminists start rewriting those classics to emphasize mutual respect. Today, echoes remain in family expectations, modern yet still tracing an ancient blueprint. Confucian ethics gave East Asia its model of filial duty and social stability, but also a structure that mistook control for harmony. Its darkness lies in how a philosophy of order quietly justified generations of inequality. The Taiping Rebellion. In mid-19th century China, a failed civil service candidate named Hong Xiuquan claimed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ sent to purify the empire. His message blended Christian imagery, Chinese mysticism, and revolutionary anger. Millions followed him, forming the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. From 1850 to 1864, the Qing dynasty fought to crush the movement. The war killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Hong's followers banned opium and prostitution, but also imposed rigid theocracy and burned temples of Buddhism and Confucianism. Cities switched faiths at gunpoint. What began as spiritual rebellion against corruption became apocalyptic nightmare. Hunger, executions, and fanatic purity consumed the land until the Taiping capital, Nanjing, fell. The Taiping Rebellion remains a cautionary epic, how borrowed religious visions can exploit despair, turning salvation into slaughter. In the ruins of its heavenly kingdom, faith was left looking eerily human, capable of both hope and unstoppable destruction. Religious anti-Semitism in Europe.
Long before race became a political category, hatred of Jews was justified through religion. From the early Middle Ages onward, church teachings in Europe branded Jews as the killers of Christ, banned them from guilds, and confined them to ghettos. Popes alternated between protection and persecution. Sermons fanned panic whenever times grew hard. During the Black Death of the 14th century, entire Jewish communities were burned alive after being blamed for the plague. In 1492, Spain expelled its Jewish population. In later centuries, blood libel myths and forced conversions spread across the continent. Even reformers like Luther wrote pamphlets steeped in venom. This religious hostility laid the soil for modern racial anti-Semitism centuries later. Millions of people learned to see discrimination as piety. By the 19th century, Christian Europe's theological prejudice had morphed into the pseudoscience that fed the Holocaust. The darkest irony, a faith founded by a Jewish teacher, became the excuse to torment his descendants. Anti-Semitism's endurance reminds us that spiritual language can become a code for fear, and that every creed must continually police its heart against that mutation.
Human sacrifice in Aztec and other pre-Columbian religions. Across Mesoamerica before Spanish contact, ritual killing was seen as a cosmic duty, not cruelty. For the Aztec Empire, the gods had sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion. Humans repaid that debt with blood. At Tenochtitlan, captives from continuous war were offered atop the Templo Mayor. Chroniclers describe hearts lifted, still beating, blood feeding the stone idols. And though reports are exaggerated by conquistadores, archaeology confirms vast ceremonial remains. The Mixtec, Maya, and earlier Olmec civilizations also practiced forms of ritual sacrifice, sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced. Each act was meant to sustain fertility, rain, and cosmic order. To them, the line between life and the divine was cyclical, not moral. But scaled up into empire, it became industrialized faith, conquest for offerings. When the Spanish destroyed these empires, they used the rituals to brand entire peoples barbarian, erasing context even as they ended the practice. Today, scholars read the altars and murals as grim dialogues with mortality. The Aztec temples stand as proof that devotion taken to extremes can sanctify horror.
Modern cultic extremes. The 20th century exploded with movements that proved fanaticism isn't ancient history. In 1978, Jim Jones led over 900 followers of the People's Temple in a mass murder-suicide in Jonestown, Guyana. In 1995, the Aum Shinrikyo sect in Japan released sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, killing 13 and injuring thousands. In 1997, Heaven's Gate members in California took their own lives expecting to ascend to an alien afterlife. Each began with spiritual yearning and community. Each ended with total obedience to a single leader. They mixed scripture, apocalypse, and charisma into sealed worlds where doubt equaled betrayal. Sociologists track more than 30 such tragedies since the 1960s. Every one shows how isolation and certainty grow lethal together. These episodes cut across faiths, nations, and technology. The pattern is painfully familiar. Individuals seeking meaning meet authority that promises purity. Remove accountability, and any religion, old or new, can collapse into cult. Modern extremism is simply the same ancient equation in contemporary dress. Devotion minus humility equals disaster. Political theocracy and abuse of power. Whenever spiritual authority fuses completely with state control, faith becomes government, and government becomes untouchable. This pattern repeats across history and across creeds. In medieval Europe, popes crowned kings and sold indulgences, blessing wars for profit. In ancient Iran, Zoroastrian priest kings ruled by divine light. In the modern era, 1979's Iranian Revolution replaced one autocracy with another. Clerical councils dictating law, policing morality, and executing dissent in God's name. Thousands were imprisoned or killed as enemies of Islam, proving that revolution can trade one idol for another. The same dynamic appeared elsewhere. Saudi Arabia's strict Wahhabi regime,
Taliban Afghanistan's edicts banning girls from school, and colonial missionaries who justified conquest as salvation. History keeps showing that absolute certainty, once paired with coercive power, corrodes both prayer and justice. Yet, inside those dark systems, reformers always arose. Priests who defied indulgences, imams who preached mercy, monks who sheltered the condemned. Their courage shows that belief itself isn't the enemy, only the belief that no one may question it. Theocracy's long shadow completes the series because it gathers all the others into one lesson. Every tragedy, from crusade to caste to cult, was born when convictions stopped listening, when human institutions claimed divine infallibility. Faith can inspire empathy or empire. The difference lies in whether it humbles or exalts the hand that wields it.